Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we will be discussing what the assessment objectives are in A levels and what you should know about them so that you can score the maximum marks in your essays. So let's get started. Basically, assessment objectives, remember when you're talking about assessment objective guys, these are referring to those skills, that knowledge set that you must have or that is basically expected out of a student when he or she is writing an answer so that they demonstrate that aspect or that skill or that knowledge in an exam. It's basically representing the approach or your one way to put it forward this way is that it's also representing the approach and the writing style a student should have when he's answering an essay and how sort of what is basically expected out of him from an answer for an 8 mark or a 12 mark answer. So when we are referring to assessment objectives here, I'm referring to the three assessment objectives that you have in A level exams, and irrespective of whatever the number of marks are in the question, whether it's a 6 mark case study question or an 8 mark or a 12 mark section B and C question, you need to know what assessment objectives are properly. Remember that when we are talking about when assessment objectives are telling about what is expected out of an answer and how can we use those assessment objectives in order to structure our answer properly and how to write an answer and what is sort of expected. Basically what we are doing is that we are applying our existing economic knowledge via or through those assessment objectives basically. So whatever knowledge we have, whatever economic knowledge, whatever content that we have learned, basically that content will be written and structured via on the basis of that assessment objectives, right? Because the writing style will reflect that assessment objectives. Remember, the writing style will reflect the assessment objective. And for this reason, it is mandatory as economic students that we are clearly aware of what each assessment objective wants us to do and what assessment objectives are. And I want you to all to watch the video to the end. So guys, basically, like I said before as well, we have three assessment objectives, assessment objective 1, 2 and 3. Now, if you guys haven't seen my previous video, I would want that before this video, you should go and watch the previous video, which was on understanding the paper pattern, and then come back to this video. The link of that video is in the description below. So the three assessment objectives, knowledge and understanding. So and then analysis and then evaluation. Now, in order to explain these assessment objective, what I've done is that I've, written a sample question here, which was from the March 2023 exam, and it was a 12 mark question, and through this question I'm going to be explaining the assessment objectives because there's no point in just going over what the Cambridge has mentioned regarding the assessment objectives. It's better that the assessment objectives are explained via a question. So basically the question was that assess whether the consequences of economic growth for an economy are always positive. Now remember that whenever questions start with the command, now assess whether is a command word. Whenever questions start with evaluate, to what extent, discuss, all these sort of questions basically ask us to evaluate in the exam. These are those questions that also ask us to evaluate, consider whether. This is another command word as well. Remember then, in order to score the maximum marks in an essay, it is very important for us that we are successfully fulfilling all our assessment objectives. Without fulfilling the assessment objectives, you cannot score good marks in an exam. So what you need to understand is that, for example, if you see a question here, you need to be aware that the examiner will give you marks based on how well you have provided the knowledge and understanding on this question, how well have you analyzed it in the exam, and how well have you evaluated this in the exam. So as far as the knowledge and understanding is concerned, you need to know what comes under knowledge and understanding. Unless and until you don't know what assessment objective 1 is, you will never be able to attempt this question. Unless and until you don't know what evaluation is, you will not be able to evaluate properly. Unless and until you don't know what analysis is, how will you analyze it? Right? So the question is, read the question again. It's saying assess whether the consequences of economic growth for an economy are always positive. Remember that in my previous video regarding the understanding the paper pattern, I told you about the narrative. The narrative was that what the question is asking us to do. So the question here is asking us that whether the consequences of economic growth for an economy are always positive. The question, this is the narrative here itself is saying that they are positive. So this is an opinion basically. The examiner holds a certain narrative or a certain opinion that he thinks maybe they are always positive, and maybe he's asking us to, make a judgment on whether it is positive or not. Now we can't obviously directly say that yes, they're positive or negative. We need to prove that in the exam, and probably in the end, come up with a judgment that whether it is positive or negative, or whatever our opinion is. We'll also see how to write that judgment. But then how are we going to structure this answer? Remember that when we are attempting this question, the first paragraph would always be on the introduction. We are going to introduce the topic. We're going to introduce what the subject matter is. And when you're talking about assessment objective one, knowledge and understanding, so knowledge and understanding all means about when you are providing knowledge and understanding. So the knowledge and understanding part starts with an introduction. The introduction basically comes under knowledge and understanding. But introduction is not all knowledge and understanding. There's a lot more to knowledge and understanding other than introduction. So the first paragraph is your introduction paragraph. It could comprise of 2 lines, 3 lines, however you want to structure your answer. Right? But the first paragraph is always the introduction paragraph. And remember, introduction sets the precedence of your answer. Remember that. The introduction should be very solid. It sets the precedence of your answer in the eyes of the examiner. Remember that. So when you're talking about knowledge and understanding, so remember that knowledge and understanding will be on the narrative and on the subject matter of the question. Now, the subject matter of the question is economic growth. The question has been asked from economic growth, and the narrative is whether it is positive or negative. Now, obviously, but when you say that the knowledge and understanding, so if you look at this question, it says assess whether consequences of economic growth for an economy is always positive. Now, obviously, this is a question that is coming from economic growth. So you need to provide a knowledge and understanding on economic growth here, because the consequences about economic growth being positive will form part of analysis. So when you're talking about knowledge and understanding, the knowledge and understanding part is regarding the subject matter. On what topic has the question being asked? What exactly is the question, and so the fact that you need to answer the question content or the narrative itself. For example, the narrative itself is whether the consequences are positive. So when you come to that part, whether they are positive or negative, that will form part of your analysis, right? But the knowledge and understanding would be based on the subject matter itself, and the subject matter is economic growth. That's where the question is coming from. So here you could start off by defining what economic growth is, or maybe you could start off by saying economic growth is one of the core macroeconomic objectives of the stable economic growth. Or sustained economic growth is one of the objectives of the government, and that is why policymakers are so much interested in ensuring that economic growth is rising and stable, right? And on top of that, then you define economic growth, that what economic growth is. But so you need to know what comes under knowledge and understanding. So guys, here this part involves you showing your knowledge of the syllabus content, you recalling facts as in, for example, it could be formulas and definitions. So for example, whatever it is, let's say a fact could be anything. Maybe it could be a definition in the form of a definition itself, in the form of an economic theory. Maybe, let's say, a rise in price causes a decrease in quantity demanded. So that is a fact as well. It is in the form of economic theory, right? Formulas or definitions. Now here so you define economic growth here, let's say. That's one part of how you provide that knowledge and understanding. And then you go on by saying you sort of demonstrate an understanding of the subject matter, giving appropriate explanations and examples. So if you are talking about economic growth, maybe you talk about economic growth in 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. Now those 2, 3 or 4 paragraphs would all be about knowledge and understanding, because you're talking about economic growth here. So maybe you say, and then applying that knowledge and understanding to economic information using written, numerical and diagrammatic forms. So if you apply this assessment objective 1 to economic growth, so if I summarize the knowledge and understanding, what you need to do is that you need to talk about facts, formulas and definitions, providing basic knowledge of the content, right? Providing basic understanding of the content, as in the syllabus content, whatever the subject matter of the question is, giving appropriate examples or explanations, and applying that knowledge and understanding to economic information using written, numerical and diagrammatic forms. If you want to use formulas for that, you want to use examples for that, you want to use maybe diagrams for that. So you talk about what economic growth is, then you talk about, there are 2 types of economic growth: short run, long run economic growth. By the way, I have videos on short run and long run economic growth on my YouTube channel as well. In AS macro playlist, you can see that. You talk about how short-run economic growth arises, basic. So short-run economic growth arises because of a rise in aggregate demand, or a rise in or due to a positive supply shock causing an increase in real GDP that uses existing resources to increase real GDP, while potential growth is long-run growth, is basically potential growth. And you could make a small diagram by, shifting the LRAS to the right and shifting the AD to the right when you're talking about actual growth, and then short-run growth, while shifting the LRAS to the right, showing long-run potential growth. So that is all about, or maybe you give an example that, that maybe you talk about, over the past 2-3 years, the global world has experienced falling economic growth, or slow economic growth. Or even you could talk about, the global world is slowly moving towards a recession. There's a global slowdown in the economy where real GDP growth rates are slowing down, and ultimately, the world may enter into a recession where real GDP may become negative. So this is all providing knowledge, because now you need to understand here what the exam is looking for is here. So when you're structuring an answer, you're providing basic. So you're providing basic, information on the subject matter itself. Here you haven't really answered the question up till now. You're providing basic understanding of the subject matter, and then slowly you will go on to that. You will transition your answer to that. But assessment objective. So if you properly provide everything that you know about economics, not everything, but the basic, main facts about economic growth, because you want to tell the examiner that you know what economic growth is, right? So for example, the question was on PD. So the formula for PD, that the sign is greater than 1, less than 1, equal to 1 is unitary elastic, stuff like that. The formula, maybe some diagrams. That is all knowledge and understanding about the question. So the knowledge and understanding part involves providing that, whatever knowledge you have on the topic itself, right? It's just like, on the first day of the exam, on the first day of the class, your instructor introduces that topic, and how he introduces that topic, he provides that basic information on that topic, right? So you need to tell the examiner that you know this topic in knowledge and understanding part, right? Then comes the analysis. Then comes the analysis paragraph. Now, analysis paragraph is your core paragraph. Here you are answering the narrative. The narrative of the question is that whether the consequences of economic growth are always positive. And here you come deep down. You take a deep dive into the sea, into the ocean, and you're like, bang on. You're like, these are the positive consequences of economic growth. Then you tell that yes, economic growth does have positive consequences. Obviously not always, but you do talk about the positive consequences of economic growth, such as maybe it results in a fall in unemployment. Especially it's really beneficial for developing economies. It results in higher disposable incomes, higher jobs, higher profits for firms. More tax revenues for the government, which could be used to finance, which could be used to finance spending. Economic growth would result in more exports as well, reducing your current account deficit. Now, since I'm not answering the question, so I'm not going to be going into a lot of details here, but some basic facts you need to know about analysis. That analysis would involve examining the economic issue and relationship using relevant economic concepts, theories, and information. Now, you need to understand that the purpose of the examiner here is that the examiner wants to give all these bullets, so that he or she wants you to comprehensively know what analysis is. So examining the economic issue. So maybe right now you don't have an issue at hand, because the question is of a nature which is not sort of an issue nature. Although an issue nature of a question would be discuss whether inflation is always harmful, whether deflation is always harmful, whether inflation is more harmful than deflation, whether deflation is more harmful than inflation, whether current account deficit is more harmful than a high rate of inflation. Now, these are the issues. So when you're examining these issues, you're analyzing the problem then. Analysis paragraph would mean that, right? And the relationships, maybe you're assessing the relationship between a high rate of inflation and a current account deficit, right? Using whatever economic concepts you have, whatever theories you know. Maybe when you're talking about high rate of inflation, you're talking about the fact that a rise in aggregate demand does not cause a rising inflation, because in the Keynesian theory, because Keynes did say that if the economy has slack, then or unutilized resources, then there would be inflation. So whatever concepts, theories, whatever information you have, whatever content or text you have learned, you examine that, you analyze that, you sort of form relationships between that, and you form a link between those concepts, and you answer the narrative basically, right? Let's say examining how bad deflation or inflation is. Then the fact that you select, interpret, organize economic information in written, numerical, and diagrammatic form. This also involves analysis, where you provide your core diagrams here, which are very helpful in analyzing the narrative here. So, for example, the fact that basic diagram regarding actual growth and economic growth would form part of assessment objective 1. But core diagrams that are showing positivity in real GDP and how your full employment level of real GDP is rising and how your real GDP is going up, and diagrams where you are showing that AD is causing your a rise in AD is causing your real GDP to go up and national income to go up. Those diagrams would form part of analysis. And a fall in cyclical unemployment, all those will form part of analysis. So you're interpreting the data, you're organizing the data, linking the data, selecting whatever information you have, and you're providing it in written, numerical, and diagrammatic form. If you want to provide it in numerical, for example, here, as such, numerical form would involve maybe giving some examples, such as maybe, during 2020 when the COVID came, IMF predicted that the real GDP growth rate of the world will go down by 4%. So that's again a numerical example that you can use. Using economic information to recognize pattern, relationship, cause, and effect. Now, this is basically known as chain of analysis. So when analysis, the assessment objective 2 analysis also involves creating a chain of analysis. So creating a chain of analysis does not only mean analysis. Analysis also involves chain of analysis. Chain of analysis in the sense that when you are, so here the examiner is trying to say that when you are analyzing information, make sure that you don't just state something, you create that chain of analysis. Using the, because here it's saying using the economic information, you're using the economic information in written form, but make sure that you use the economic information in written form. If you're writing the economic information, you don't forget to recognize the patterns, relationship, cause, and effect between them. So for example, if you're saying that higher inflation reduces standard of living, how does it reduce standard of living? So higher inflation increases cost of living, which causes real incomes to go down, which causes your consumption expenditure to go down, that causes consumers to buy less goods and services, which causes a decline in your standard of living as purchasing power goes down. So this is, you're creating a chain of analysis. Again, if you're saying that a rise in aggregate demand causes a fall in cyclical unemployment, or you're saying that economic growth causes unemployment to fall, so if you're saying that if growth goes up, unemployment goes down. If this is what you're saying, then there has to be a relationship between these two variables. So the cause is the rise in growth. This is the cause, and the effect is a fall in unemployment. So what is the pattern between the cause and the effect? The pattern is that if growth goes up, that is because of a rise in AD, the firms will respond by hiring more labor. So because the demand for labor will go up if the demand for goods and services go up. They hire more labor, and then unemployment goes down, and then real GDP goes up. And then this just keeps on happening, right? So that is the reason why cyclical unemployment goes down. So you need to, similarly, if you're saying that maybe if interest rates are going up, then borrowing is going down. But then why is borrowing going down? Because if interest rates are going up, then cost of borrowing is going up, which is becoming expensive for consumers and firms to borrow. And hence borrowing is going up. And that causes aggregate demand to go down, because the C component and the I component in the AD equation goes down. So this is the cause and effect, the chain of analysis. That is what the chain of analysis is. So chain of analysis is very important, because you need to understand, in my previous video I also said, it's not about what you write, how you write it. So the examiner is not concerned about you. Listen to me very carefully, guys. The examiner is not concerned about you telling the examiner that a rise in interest rate will reduce aggregate demand. Everyone knows that. Every other person knows that a rise in interest rate will reduce aggregate demand. Obviously, if you're sitting for an exam, you must know this concept. It's not possible that you don't know this. But then what the examiner is concerned about is what is the chain of analysis between them. That is what a lot of people might not know or might not be able to execute properly in the exam. So the chain of analysis has to be there. Remember, it just has to be there, right? So for example, if another example could be that if you're saying that, if inflation goes up or the inflation rate goes up, then maybe your current account deficit worsens. Then why? So you miss the part here that you're saying that inflation rate goes up, then exports get uncompetitive, and the price of exports goes up, which causes a decline in quantity of exports, which causes a decline in export revenues. That worsens the current account deficit, right? So again, the chain of analysis has to be there. The cause and effect, the relationship, the pattern between those variables needs to be properly expressed. Explain, and then analysis also includes So analysis can be multiple paragraphs, just like knowledge and understanding can be multiple paragraphs. So the structure has to be this way. So a lot of students message me on my Instagram as well. Uh, Please explain the structure of an answer. It's the structure of an answer is very simple. The structure of an answer follows the assessment objectives. That's it. So then the analysis is explain the impacts and consequences of changes in economic variables. So for example, if the question is, for example, the question here is saying assess whether the consequences of economic growth for an economy are always positive. Right? So if you're saying that maybe a fall in, if economic growth happens, then unemployment will fall. So how would unemployment fall, and what impact would that have on the economy? Why would a falling unemployment be so beneficial for an economy? So if you're saying that if unemployment goes down, then what is the impact of falling unemployment? What is the consequence of falling unemployment? So if you're saying that the benefit of economic growth is unemployment goes down, so what? What happens? What will happen because of a fall in unemployment? The fact, now here you talk about the impact. You talk about here you talk about the impact of a fall in unemployment. You talk about the consequence of a fall in unemployment by saying, what the impact and consequence would be that if unemployment goes down, the material and non-material living standards will improve and the incomes will improve, which will be good for developing economies. Developing economies will be able to generate more revenues through which they could pay off their debts. The debt to GDP ratio will go down, stuff like that. So that is why, this is analysis. You go take a deep dive into what the narrative is, and you go hands on to the narrative, and you clear the examiner that this is my knowledge. That's what, in simple slang words, what analysis is, right? So I hope you have understood, and like I also have written here, just let me go through. But I think I just explained this as well, that the pattern relationship cause and effect chain of analysis is talking about that. For example, the pattern relationship cause and effect. That's what chain of analysis is. Right? So a rise in interest rate would increase cost of borrowing, making borrowing expensive, increasing the incentive to save. So as borrowing becomes expensive, incentives to save goes up. As borrowing goes down and savings go up, consumption and investment goes down as consumers and firms find it expensive to borrow, which reduces the consumption and expenditure and investment expenditure, hence causing a fall in C and I in the AD equation. A fall in AD causes real GDP and price level to fall as shown below. And a lot of students also say that if aggregate demand falls, price level falls. Where is the pattern relationship cause and effect? What do you mean pattern relationship cause and effect? So simple. If AD goes down, price level goes down. But again, you are missing the cause and effect in the relationship and the price level. The relationship between that is that if AD goes down, the thing is that if AD goes down, firms cut back on output, which causes factors of production to get redundant, which reduces the pressure on those factors of production. The pressure on the factors of production go down, and that feeds through lower price level in the economy. So a lot of people fail to express the relationship that why would a fall in AD cause price level to go down. The reason is that as AD goes down, firms cut back on output, and because of that, because the demand for labor is going down because of the falling demand for goods and services, they make the workers redundant. When they make the workers redundant, there's excess capacity. That reduces the pressure on the factors of production. As the pressure on the factors of production goes down, their factor prices goes down, and that feeds through a lower demand per inflation. Again, this is the chain of analysis. The cause, effect, the pattern, the relationship. What a relationship exists between falling AD and falling price level. You need to explain that relationship between these two variables. Failure to do so will always result in lower marks. And a lot of students don't even know this. And they're always like, why am I getting lower marks? So I hope through this video, I am able to communicate to a larger audience. And that is why I would really request you to share this video with with other people as well. So for example, here I've also written another thing that analysis. If you're explaining a numerical, if you're giving a numerical perspective, you could say, for example, the question is on YD, on how important is knowledge of, on how would. So for example, if you're saying that maybe if you're giving a YD analysis, we could say that a 10% rise in income would cause, what effect would that have on the quantity demanded of good if YD is plus 4? So if the coefficient of YD is plus 4, it's a normal good, and you're saying that if income goes up by 10%, what impact? So explaining it through an example or a numerical thing is also part of analysis, okay? Then comes the most dangerous part. Not the dangerous, but students find it dangerous, but I hope I'll make it less traumatic for the kids. So assessment objective 3, remember, it is always, evaluation is always given in those questions that say, talks about, the question, the command word, the command word of the question is to what extent, discuss, assess whether, evaluate whether, consider whether. These sort of questions ask us to there's the assessment objective 3 part evaluation involved in it. So when you, and now 8 markers and 12 markers will have evaluation, because the nature of the question will be such that it will involve evaluation. If you look at old past papers before the syllabus change of 2023, you will see that the questions were of a nature that they did not mention consider whether, assess whether, discuss whether. But if you see the specimen paper in the Feb-March paper, it talks about the 8 markers, also talks about the questions in 8 markers or 12 markers are designed in a way that they involve the element of evaluation in it. Right? So evaluation, guys, remember, is one part of evaluation is a counter narrative. So if the question is asking you to, whether the consequences of economic growth are always positive, so you're like, now here you counter argue that no, the consequences of economic growth are not always positive. There are negative consequences as well. So that will form part of evaluation. No, this is not always positive. And why? You tell that why is it not always positive. So remember that in nutshell, what evaluation is, that evaluation involves a lot of things. And bringing the examiner's mindset to a certain viewpoint or an opinion is what evaluation is. That you're proving something to the examiner. You're making him believe something through your wordings. What are you making him believe? You're making him believe that economic growth is not always positive. So you could talk about the fact that maybe if the growth is unrestrained, rampant, unrestrained economic growth and rampant economic growth will accelerate demand for inflation. That doesn't make economic growth positive, because high demand for inflation can reduce international competitiveness and cause the cost of living to go up. So here you're bringing the examiner to a certain viewpoint. And that is what evaluation is, through your counter narrative. And you could talk about what if the economic growth is resulting in what if economic growth is resulting in negative externalities such as resource depletion and deforestation and resource degradation and soil erosion, which will reduce living standards, right? So on one hand, economic growth is causing an increase in welfare through higher economic growth and higher incomes, but on the other hand, through these negative production externalities such as oil pollution and resource degradation is causing a loss of welfare and a loss of living standards. So again, this sort of a wording, this sort of a writing style, this sort of a counter narrative where you're trying to bring the examiner to a certain opinion and finally transitioning the answer to a judgment is what evaluation is, right? You could even say that maybe economic growth does not necessarily means that economic growth does not necessarily means that incomes are rising for everyone in the society. What is growth is generated from only one dominant sector. In that case, it would result in income inequality if the growth is not equally distributed, right? In that case, it will result in income inequality and relative poverty in society. The gap between the rich and the poor will worsen. So, because if growth is generated from only one dominant sector in the economy, then it will only benefit those people who are the entrepreneurs and the business owners and the people who work in that sector only. What about the other sectors in the economy? The growth should be balanced. So this sort of a writing style is what evaluation is. And evaluation will involve a lot of things. It will involve you recognizing assumptions and limitations of economic information and models. So for example, if you're talking about, if the question is on elasticity, discuss how knowledge of PED is relevant to businesses. You recognize that, the knowledge of PED is very much relevant to businesses in terms of it helps them strategize their pricing policies and all of that, and that has an subsequent impact on revenues. But then we can't ignore the fact that PED has its own limitations, and limitations video of PED is all on my YouTube as well, because now you are criticizing, because you are recognizing the fact that although yes, PED is beneficial in terms of assisting the pricing strategy and all, but then there are limitations involved as well. Maybe the PED calculation goes wrong. Maybe PED itself is based on a lot of assumptions, and recognizing those assumptions and challenging those assumptions and being aware of those assumptions, of the biasness involved in those assumptions, needs to be addressed. That doesn't make PED the best model for solely basing pricing decisions on. Maybe you could say that. Right? So again, this is a counter narrative, because you're saying that PED is successfully helps in business, assess revenues and increase revenues through pricing policies and etc. etc. But then there are certain limitations as well of price elasticity of demand that needs to be recognized. That is also evaluation. Assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the argument. So here maybe you could say that trade protection is good for domestic industries. It's good for domestic industries. Trade protection is good for domestic industries, but the same argument that we are giving right now is weak if it is protecting inefficient firms, right? So trade protection is good, but then this argument to protect domestic industries is weak if it's protecting inefficient firms. So recognizing that, whatever arguments that we are giving in favor or against something, recognizing that the strengths and weaknesses of those arguments is also part of evaluation. Because here you are steering the examiner's mindset into believing something. And that is the core aim of what evaluation is. Recognize the fact that you want to steer the examiner's mind into believing something is what evaluation is. In slang words, if I'm saying, in simple words, if I'm saying, in fact, not slang. So guys, evaluation also recognizes that, let's say, some economic decisions involve the consideration of factors such as prioritizing and value judgments. Now, obviously, if you're saying something and that has a value judgment or a normative element involved in it. So for example, you could say that, let's say, expansionary, let's say you're saying that expansionary monetary policy might be better than expansionary fiscal policy. But then this has a value judgment involved, and this is also based on certain consideration of factors. Maybe an expansionary monetary policy is better than expansionary fiscal policy for a particular country. Then you need to mention that. Why is it beneficial for a particular country? For a country that has high level of national debt. Because expansionary fiscal policy would involve budget deficits. Budget deficits would involve the government borrowing to finance that deficit, which will increase national debt. So maybe the government is very poor and not in a position to increase the debt levels right now, because a lot of debt also panics domestic and foreign investors and increases the debt to GDP ratio. So right now, maybe, if you are saying that expansionary monetary policy is beneficial, then evaluation would mean that you recognize the fact that this has a value judgment involved in it, and this is based on certain specific arguments and considerations. Also remember, the last part of evaluation is a conclusion and a judgment. So remember this. Evaluation is not a conclusion. The last part of evaluation, the last paragraph of the assessment objective, is always a judgment which in the form of a conclusion. Judgment in the form of a conclusion. Right? So that is where the evaluation ends. Communicate reasoned judgments, conclusions, and decisions based on the arguments. Right? So for example, assess whether the consequences of growth for an economy is always positive. But before that, if you're saying that, whether the growth is always positive, so when you talk about when you give a counter narrative and then you sort of want to sort of end your answer, so you could say that the fact that economic growth, so this is your now you're sort of framing and judgment and ending the answer. Because now you're steering your examiner into your final judgment views, and which is based on logical evidence that you have already given in the above paragraphs in evaluation through your counter narratives. And you're like, the fact that, so you are saying that whether the consequences of economic growth for an economy is always positive. So you're saying that economic growth is a very essential and a good macroeconomic indicator for measuring economic development and welfare, but it is not the best indicator because it has a lot of limitations and negative consequences involved as well. Whether growth is positive or not, first of all, it's not that it will always be positive. This is what you need to write. It's not that it's always positive. So the narrative that it's always positive is false, because economic growth is not always positive. So you're going to say that economic growth is not always positive, but yes, it could be positive, but not always positive. But it could be positive if certain factors are present. For example, let's say if the growth is inclusive, if the growth is sustainable, if the growth is balanced, coming from all the sectors in the economy instead of just one dominant sector, if the growth is not rampant, right? If the growth is sustainable, that is, it is not at the expense of significant negative externalities, neither that economic growth is the expense of significant inflation, right? If the growth is balanced, if it's sustained, if all of these factors are present, then yes, growth will result into positive outcomes, and hence it will be desirable. This is how you end your answer. Right? So here you have mentioned that if they are not present, it will be undesirable, it won't be positive. If this is present, it will be positive. But obviously you can't just jump to this. You need to lead the examiner into this mindset. But before that, you have to give a counter argument, because the examiner needs to know in the answer that if you're saying that, it should, if you're saying that if the growth will be sustained or inclusive or balanced only, then it will be positive, then obviously you have something in mind which is telling us that obviously you have something in mind that is telling us that growth will at one point not be positive. And if what are those points that needs to be mentioned in the evaluation? Okay, guys. So I think I have majorly covered the assessment objectives here, and that was the purpose of my video, to explain in detail what assessment objectives are. I hope you enjoyed the video. If yes, do mention it in the comments. I read the comments. Until then, take care.